Man, a lot to talk about today. There's a lot going on in the world right now. And France and Europe, I really do feel for them because they have had so much going on in recent weeks. You've got the situation going on in Ukraine, which we've been talking about a lot. And there is some actual good news on that front, which I wasn't expecting. Apparently, Russia has kind of quit their quit may be a strong word. They've reduced their bullying tactics when it came to Crimea. They're still in control of that region, but they have opened up the passageways to the Azov, I believe that's the way to pronounce it, the Azov Sea. And so they are letting Ukraine boats through now. And I mean, that's a good development. It's far from a solution, but that is a step in the right direction. But there is a long way to go on that front. And another thing that's interesting is what's going on right now in France. And I really hate it for the French people, but they have been just erupting in different protests here recently. And if you're looking at what's going on, I mean, it looks like a war zone if you're looking at pictures from what's going on in Paris right now. And what's ironic about this, and you will not hear this from the mainstream media, ask yourself why these protests took place. Whenever the mainstream media reports it, what they're saying is, well, it's because of a tax hike in gas prices, which on its face is kind of true, but here's what they're leaving out. Do you know why Macron put those taxes forward? Do you know what those taxes are going for? In France, you have about 80% of the people, according to an opinion poll, that believe that global warming is a huge problem and it is detrimental and it's something that we need to do something about. And yet, despite this high approval rating of policies that they say should be put forward to curtail global warming, the reason for these taxes is so that they can fund the Paris Accords. That's what's going on here. And you're not hearing that from the mainstream media. The reason these protests are taking place are because of these taxes that were put in place specifically to fund the measures that France has to put in place now on its government to be in compliance with the Paris Climate Accords. And so basically the French people are taking the position, I guess, of, well, I think that we should do something about global warming, but I ain't going to pay for it. And you're seeing this outrage. They were the ones that were pushing and approving these stupid backwards policies. But now all of a sudden when they realize, oh, it actually is going to cost us billions of dollars, then they get upset about it because they're increasing their taxes. Which again, I feel for the French people. And as somebody who is a big opponent of taxes myself, I understand the frustration. But keep in mind that it was your ideas and your policies that wound up eventually leading to this. And so when it comes to the French people, there is a genuine compassion coming from me on their behalf, but this is kind of something they did to themselves. That doesn't mean that there's no compassion there, but in retrospect, I can say, look, maybe you shouldn't have jumped headfirst into this thing. And this is the issue that you're running into. There was a similar tweet that came out that sort of, it's a very different news story, but it springs from the same problem. There was a town hall about climate change and a bunch of prominent Democrats showed up to it, one of which was Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, the newest and youngest person in the representative of the House. She hasn't actually taken office yet. That will be in the new year. But for the House of Representatives from New York's, I think, 8th District, I'd have to check the districts. But from that district, you have Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, and she comes in and is talking about how the only way that we're going to be able to beat climate change is if we act courageously. And I'm sitting here thinking, what is courageous about spending other people's money? Seriously, explain that one to me. Your plan calls for taking money from the citizens and using that money to curtail a potential cataclysmic event, which there is very little evidence for, and you think may or may not be a big problem elsewhere. First of all, if we're going to spend that much money on anything, regardless of what it is, we need to be darn sure that the science is 100% foolproof on that. And in this particular case, where it's certainly not, that's not a wise use of funds. But even so, I don't understand this idea that that is somehow courageous. It's courageous to spend your money on something that is highly risky and may never come to pass, but it is certainly not courageous to do so with other people's money. If I'm spending somebody else's money and I buy a really nice steak dinner, that is not a courageous action. It doesn't really make any sense, but that's kind of par for the course when it comes to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And when we're talking about what's going on in Europe right now, and we're talking about what's going on in France, this is going to be a really big issue all across Europe, because what you're seeing is you're seeing this divergence in the two big sides of the issue, not just on climate change, but just in general in Europe. And the reason that I say that, and the reason that this is an important problem to point out, is that we're seeing very similar ideologies cropping up that happened in the first parts of World War I and World War II, or the lead up to them. This strong fight between socialism and nationalism. And you're seeing the same sort of protest happening in smaller scale in other nations in Europe. It's happening most prominently in France right now, but you're also seeing it happen with the bad Brexit deal that's happening in England, and some of the demands for England on what they're going to do in Brexit are just ridiculous. I mean, you're looking at it and they're basically saying, we want you to get none of the benefits of being in the EU, but we want you to be forced to have to deal with all of the obligations. So in other words, all the stuff that sucks about being in the EU, you have to continue to comply with those, but any of the stuff that you would get a benefit from, that you're not going to be able to get. It's one of the most ridiculous deals that I've ever seen. This whole them trying to force England into basically doing their bidding despite trying to get out of the EU, and that being the entire purpose for the vote. So you've got this real destabilization that is going on in Europe that we really need to keep an eye on, because otherwise it's going to kind of blindside us, and we're going to be standing there looking like, well, what happened to Europe? Well, these are problems that we need to deal with now, because again, this whole nationalism versus communism thing, that's exactly the same fight that led up to 2 world wars.